answer is, it's time for another lesson. Hey Bio-30s, I'm back again for another lesson. I'm just kidding with that, we're not doing any math today. I don't even think I know the answer to that question. What we are talking about today is the endocrine system. So we're going to talk about your hormones, just generally some glands involved in the endocrine system. I'll give you a few examples of some feedback loops, and then as we move on, we'll get more specific into certain hormones, where they come from and what they do. So here's a look at your endocrine system. So your endocrine system is composed of glands. Now what a gland is it's a structure that makes a hormone. So for example, we have the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. We talked about that in parts of the brain video. Those are glands that produce hormones. Same thing with the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the pancreas, the adrenal gland, as well as the testes and ovaries. Now we're not going to cover the testes and ovaries until the reproductive system. So we're just going to focus on the hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, pancreas, and adrenal glands. So we talked about the nervous system. So the nervous system and the endocrine system, they go hand in hand. So they work as a team. The nervous system is a more fast, rapid response, whereas the endocrine system is a slower response. So for example, glands will secrete hormones. They'll go directly into your blood, and then they'll have some type of effect on your body. So for example, the pancreas will secrete insulin. Insulin will increase the uptake of glucose as more insulin is produced. So they have some type of effect on your body. Now, like I said, the nervous system is a rapid response. The endocrine system is a longer and slower response. But they do work together as a tandem. So for example, in a stressful situation, epinephrine is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. So you produce the neurotransmitter epinephrine in your nervous system, but you also produce the epinephrine adrenaline hormone for your endocrine system. So there are some overlaps as well. Now when we look at the endocrine system, right, hormones are produced directly into the bloodstream. So the pancreas will produce hormones directly into the bloodstream, as opposed to exocrine glands, which will produce things like enzymes and different secretions into ducts. So you might remember things like lipase, things like amylase, right? Those things being produced, but they go through a different pathway. So the pancreas itself is both an exo and endocrine gland because it produces both hormones into the bloodstream, and it also produces enzymes into the duct system, which eventually ends up in your intestines. So when we look at the path of a hormone, the hormone will then be secreted into the blood and then bind to the target cells. When it binds to the cells, it will have some type of effect on those cells. So it could increase the uptake of glucose. It could increase the uptake of water, right? It could increase the rate of cellular respiration. It will bind to the targeted cells and then cause that cell to then undergo some type of change. Now, not all hormones affect every cell in the body. So for example, insulin is what we call a non-targeting hormone, meaning insulin is going to affect most cells in the body. Same with HGH, human growth hormone. It's going to affect most cells in the body. So it's going to affect muscle cells, liver cells, skin cells. It's going to affect most cells in the body. So it's not targeting a specific area of the body, it's affecting most of it. Whereas a targeted hormone only targets certain cells. A good example of this is the hormone ADH. ADH is produced by the hypothalamus, released by the pituitary into the blood. But ADH isn't going to target your liver cells. It's not going to target your muscle cells. ADH will only target your kidney and nephron cells. So it's only targeting the kidneys. So when ADH passes by a cell that doesn't have its receptors on it, it's not going to do anything. ADH is going to have no effect on the liver. But when it passes through the kidney, it will bind to the kidney and increase water reabsorption. So when we look at hormones, we always look at hormones in terms of what's called a feedback loop. So we show where the hormone is coming from, what the hormone is doing, and then how we can ultimately turn that hormone off. So the stimulus here in my example is it's time for a growth spurt. So you're about to go through a growth spurt. What's going to happen? It's going to begin with the hypothalamus releasing a releasing hormone. Now, a releasing hormone or releasing factor, you don't have to know each individual one. It's essentially the trigger that the hypothalamus uses to activate the pituitary. So every hormone has a specific releasing hormone that the hypothalamus will secrete. So once the releasing hormone is released, it will go down to the pituitary gland, and cause the pituitary to then make and release HGH. Now, HGH is a non-targeting hormone. It's going to increase bone growth, tissue growth, muscle growth, protein synthesis, cellular respiration. It's essentially going to cause your body to grow. That's the increase in growth because of the growth factor, right? So growth factor is released, you're growing bones, you're growing muscles, right? You're getting taller, you're increasing the rate of growth. You're also increasing the amount of glucose in your blood because you're going to need energy to do this, and you're also going to increase the rate of cellular respiration to ultimately get that energy. Now, what happens when it's time to stop HGH? So what happens when you're done with the HGH, or you're done with your growth, or HGH is at an adequate level? We're going to have something called negative feedback. So negative feedback is kind of like, I like to think of it like a light switch. So you turn on the light switch, you turn on the hormones, right? So for example, you turn on one light switch, that's the releasing factor, that causes another light switch to go on, that's the hormone. Now when you're done, right, you're done with this hormone, negative feedback means you go to the top of the pathway, think of it like a waterfall or a cascade, you go to the top and turn that off first, which will then turn off the second part of this feedback loop. So for example, I would flip off the first light switch, which is the releasing factor or releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus turns that off. Once the hypothalamus turns that off, the pituitary is no longer stimulated to release HGH. So now the pituitary is going to turn off HGH. That's the second light switch. And then finally, since there's a decreased number or decreased amount of HGH, we're going to have less growth, and eventually this effect will die down. It's not going to happen instantly, right? Hormones are a longer process, but once the HGH is turned off, this effect will eventually stop. Now, when we talk about hormones, I mentioned this in the brain video, but most hormones are coming from the pituitary hypothalamus complex, because that's where a lot of our hormones are coming from. We do have the other glands like the pancreas, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal glands, but we often refer to the pituitary as the master gland because so many different hormones are coming from it. And it is that connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary that allows us to maintain homeostasis and regulate all these different processes in our body, like calcium regulation, like water reabsorption, like blood pressure, we got stress response, we have a whole reproductive hormones, we have a whole bunch of things going on here. So it's just a quick look at the pituitary. So we have our hypothalamus up here, and it's connected directly to the pituitary. Now the pituitary is two sides. It has a posterior and an anterior side. If a hormone comes from the anterior pituitary, it means it is made, stored, and released by the pituitary. Some anterior hormones include TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, which is the adrenocorticotropin hormone. We have prolactin, which is a reproductive hormone, so we don't need to focus on it too much right now. HGH, as well as FSH and LH, which are also both reproductive hormones. So once again, these are all made, stored, and released by the pituitary. The hypothalamus just says when, and the pituitary releases them. On the posterior side, we have hormones like oxytocin and ADH. These are actually produced by the hypothalamus, stored and released by the pituitary. So it's a little bit different there. So the hypothalamus is going to make the ADH, make the oxytocin, store it in the posterior pituitary, and then release it when necessary. So next lesson, we're going to focus in on a specific set of hormones. So we're going to look at the glucose hormones as well as the stress hormones. I'm going to go through the feedback loops with you. So when we're doing these hormones, the three things you really need to focus on are where are the hormones coming from, right? So what glands are releasing them? What are the hormones doing? So that's going to be our feedback loops. And the third thing is diseases and disorders. So what happens if we have too much of this hormone? What happens if we have not enough? So that's it for today. Thanks again for watching. We'll chat soon.